everybody. I'd like to call the work session of the Williamsburg City Council of Monday, October 5th to order. Thank you for turning on my microphone in the back. Ms. Malika, would you call the roll, please?
Mr. Rogers?
Here.
Ms. Ramsey?
Here.
Mayor Pons?
Here.
Vice Mayor Dent?
Here.
Mr. Maslin?
Here. Okay, so item number 3, items for City Council meeting on October 8th. Mr. Trivett?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. We've got a fairly busy schedule on Thursday. We've got an update of the city's ordinance regarding electric power-assisted bicycles, the end-of-the-year school spending plan for the school system approval. We've got the documents required for the approval of the EV RIFA first program or project. We have a resolution establishing some grant programs for the tourism industry, the updated regional police mutual aid agreement, and the consideration of the acquisition, execution of the right to possession for the property that used to be the Crossroads Youth Group Home on Moortown Road.
Okay.
Sorry, it took me a minute to spit those words out. I got there finally.
Until I try to read it. Any questions for Mr. Trivett? Okay, seeing none there, so we have a public hearing opportunity, public comment session here, if anybody would like to come forward. All those shy people in the back don't want to come up. Okay. So there will be no public comments. So today we have background presentations, and we're fortunate to have with us Vicki Cimino from the Williamsburg Tourism Council. She comes quarterly, thereabouts, to give us an update on things. And so, Vicki, if you'd like to come forward. I see you want to...
Yes, I've got the clicker here,
Got
but I
the
don't...
clicker, so we're going from there. All righty.
Do I have to click anything to get it to my stuff?
Try it. Let's see what happens.
Thank you.
There
Oh,
you go.
there we go. Yes, you do. So, all right. Well, thank you, Mr. Mayor, Mr. Vice Mayor, and members of City Council. I appreciate the opportunity to be here to share an update with you today. The last time I presented to the group, and we've got a couple of new folks on board, so you may or may not have seen that presentation, but I talked a lot about our bridge campaign effort, which launched in May. The greater Williamsburg area was the first destination in the Commonwealth of Virginia to launch an effort that early on. I also talked about our Shop and Dine Local effort, our summer campaign, which was sort of the biggest of the three. And I talked a lot about research. We focused on consumer sentiment kind of during the months of COVID lockdown, conducted more than 12 focus groups. We conducted ad testing for the summer 2020 campaign. And today I'd like to kind of review some of those numbers, talk about our summer campaign performance, and give you a sneak peek at fall. So let's start with the numbers. And they're not pretty, but they're moving in the right direction. So in August of 2020, we were at 36.5% occupancy versus 70% in August of 2019. Rate has also taken a hit. We are at $88.41 for the average daily rate versus $133.46 1 year ago. So we're off by about $45.05 for our average daily rate. Year to date, we're at 25.6% in occupancy versus 53% 1 year ago. So that being said, and it's nowhere near where we had wanted or hoped to be at this point, but we are moving in the right direction. April occupancy was at 10.5%, in May 14.6%, in June 22.7%, and in July 33.0%. So we are creeping in the right direction, and we're hoping that as we continue on in recovery, we will see those numbers increase and get back to the hope that we had of beating that 50% in occupancy for year-over-year figures. So just to give you an idea of some of our key funding sources for the Williamsburg Tourism Council, the transient tax being one of those. This will show you May activity. May taxes decreased for the revenue figures that come into the Tourism Council by 77.8% year over year. So we were at $23,000 in tax revenue to the Williamsburg Tourism Council in 2020 versus $103,000 in 2019. The 3-month moving average was down 67.2% versus that same time frame last year. The sales tax, being the other major source of funding for the Williamsburg Tourism Council, may decrease by 24.6% year over year, so came in at $736,000 in 2020 versus $975,000 in 2019, with a 3-month moving average of 26% down. So the sales tax was less impacted than we had budgeted for. Transient tax was slightly better than we had budgeted for. That being said, the Tourism Council was able to continue moving forward with a robust summer ad campaign, and will go into 2021 in a fairly healthy cash position. So let's talk about some of the promotional work that we did. To remind you, we did launch a Shop Dine Local effort. It ran for 3 weeks. Reminding residents to support local businesses, it achieved 1.3 million impressions with a 0.1% engagement rate. So that is the high end of the industry benchmark. So that performed well. We were pleased to see that. And our summer 2020 campaign, which launched in June, has now concluded. We're going right into fall. The campaign is called Life at Your Pace. We targeted families and couples, both millennials, Gen Xers, and active mature, all 3 of those. Or families, just millennials and Gen X, couples, all 3 of those categories. We ran in 21 markets, and we focused and targeted 3 personas: culture questers, simple strivers, and seers and doers. So this is one of 3 television spots that we ran in 20 markets. With the Life at Your Pace campaign effort, we wanted to focus on the attributes of tourism destinations that tested well with consumers. Consumers want to feel safe, they want wide open spaces, they want to visit outdoor areas, they want to avoid crowded, compact urban environments. And so this is just a quick glimpse at what the Life at Your Pace campaign looked like. Nearly all of our digital ads drove to a microsite that communicated just that. Williamsburg is opening safely. You can see here we built a new section to our website that allowed businesses to go in and check off safety procedures that they had put into place, so that as visitors were checking out the destination, they could see there were physical barriers installed, there was social distancing implemented, things like that. So just to give you an idea of how that campaign was performing for us, Life at Your Pace achieved 154 million impressions just through early September with a 0.26 click-through rate. So the industry average is 0.10, so you'll see we're beating that average by 16%, and a video completion rate of 94%, where the benchmark is typically 85%. One of our tactics is Adara, and that is a company that has first-party relationships with travel brands. So we can track when somebody clicks on one of our ads through Adara and then goes on to book hotel stays here in the area or airfare. And our ads with Adara alone resulted in 1,377 hotel bookings in the month of August, and that is an increase over the year before. For our website, overall sessions are down 4%, but given sort of the global pandemic, that's actually not too bad. So we're doing, we're not doing as well as we had last year, but we're doing better than a lot of other travel brands out there right now. So August and September, early September, did show strong year-over-year increases. So as the year goes on, each month you see a little more activity. The real important soundbite here is that 82% of visitors to the site had never been to visit Williamsburg.com before. So that shows that we are tapping into new audiences and driving awareness in areas that we hadn't before. Part of our campaign is also email. So we distributed 7 emails to our current subscriber list, and then also through a company called Vista Graphics. We saw a 24% increase in open rates so far this year, and a 77% increase in click rates. A major component of our paid media plan is focused on bringing social media influencers to the area. And through these partnerships and bringing these folks to the area, we were able to tap into 1.3 million additional people and had 136,000 engagements because of this partnership. And this is just a fun example. This is a social media influencer who I believe she's got 1.3 million followers, Amber Fillerup, and you can see it's just kind of fun to see some of the comments that her followers have. So as she was posting in the area, you can see, go to the cheese shop and just kind of different things that people who have visited the area enjoy doing. In addition to that paid media effort, we have a strong earned media public relations program in place. And so while we have less placements, because frankly it is a different kind of a media environment amidst a pandemic, our impressions are up by several hundred million. So some of the key news clips that we were able to achieve through actively pitching the destination to travel writers included National Geographic, Country Living, and Essence. In addition to what we did independent of the industry, we offered a cooperative marketing program, which was a one-to-one matching co-op opportunity. We had 5 participants and matched $72,500 in funds. We did select 2 key media outlets for that, TripAdvisor and Adara, primarily because we're able to get so granular in the type of data that we're able to see as a result of the effort. And this is a great example of Jamestown Yorktown Foundation and their advertisement. Part of the criteria for us to match those funds is to use our templated creative, one of our headlines that we had used, and then the learn more goes to either their website or their listing on visitwilliamsburg.com. So I'm going to go into some research here a little bit and talk through some numbers, but I was compelled to include this chart from eMarketer. And you'll see here that travel ranks high across all income brackets as major purchases on the return to normal, once things return to normal. So that is good news for the travel and tourism industry. I'm going to talk a little bit now about how our ad campaign performed through early September. We work with a company called Smari out of Indianapolis. They have a focus on tourism destinations, more than 33 years of experience, and they've worked with 20 state tourism offices, 38 convention and visitors bureaus or destination marketing organizations, and 23 attractions. Our objectives here were to really figure out how our campaign was working. Were people aware of the ads that we had out in market? Were they familiar with the destination? And how did they rank the destination? And so this chart will tell you basically that consumers remain confused and kind of polarized on either side. 34% of those polled, and we have a sample size of roughly 2,500 people in our key designated market areas, 34% strongly agreed that they needed to get away now more than ever, and 33% strongly agreed that the thought of traveling scares them. So people are still on sort of either side of that spectrum, really. As far as the ads are concerned, from a consumer perception change, customers' likelihood to travel has doubled since mid-April from 33% to 66%. So we're moving, again, in the right direction. What the COVID-19 impact has had on leisure travel, 36% of travelers have not taken a trip since 2020 and don't plan to, or since spring of 2020 and don't plan to in 2020 at all. So again, you've got, I mean, it's about as close as you can get to 50-50 on either side of that spectrum still. But we still wanted to see how our campaign, we stayed in market. We want to continue to build consumer awareness. We want to continue to build that pipeline so that when people feel safer to travel, they'll have Williamsburg top of mind. And so the Life at Your Pace campaign was tested, again, across 2,500 individuals that fit sort of our target audience in our target geographic areas. And we ran digital banner display ads, native Facebook video advertising, broadcast television advertising, And the good news is that in June and July, just those 2 months alone, and remember that summer just ended, so August and half of September are not included in this chart, that we were targeting 15 million households. We achieved 31% awareness with a media spend of $1.9 million just in those 2 months alone, and our cost per aware household was 41 cents. The industry benchmark is 67 cents. So what does that mean? We were really efficient. We were targeting folks and we were getting that click-through and awareness for a much less expensive rate than the industry average. And we did increase an awareness change. Awareness level achieved in June and July was similar to last year's entire campaign with $3 million less spend. So we did end up spending, again, that $3 million in August and then through the middle of September, but with less money, we achieved similar awareness this year with our new campaign. And did our ads impact familiarity or intent to travel to the area? Well, the answer is yes. Intent to visit more than doubled after viewing our ads amongst those polled, and we had more impact and larger increases in our expansion markets. So the conclusions on that front, before I go back to talking about marketing and the campaign that we've got at play, is that we were able to maintain a level of campaign awareness with a new campaign, which is unheard of. I mean, we are in the middle of a pandemic. People aren't traveling. We launched a new campaign effort. We launched new markets, and we were still able to maintain a level of awareness that is strong and efficient. And by efficient, again, we dramatically reduced the cost per aware household, and we continued to build a familiarity about the destination. So that was summer, and looking ahead at fall, we've got quite a bit going on, and we've just launched fall. We will continue to target millennials and Gen X couples, active mature as well, and families, millennials and Gen Xers with children. We'll continue to focus on our key core attributes: history, food and beverage, arts and culture, entertainment, and outdoors and golf. Our geography, or target geography, looks a lot like summer did. We've got the same 21 markets here. We're going to keep Cleveland and Columbus in the mix. We're seeing an increase in visitation to our website from those two markets, and we know that as travel continues to rebound and come back, that we've got a stronghold there that we'll look forward to seeing some real results next year. We'll continue on with many of the same tactics that we've used in the past: television advertising, digital display, partnering with groups like Pandora. I'm sure for those of you who are cheap like me, who don't get the uncommercial version of Pandora, you might hear our ads, and then certainly social is one of our top performing tactics. We'll also introduce a mini campaign effort, and we're going to test this and see how it works. With so many people in so many of our target markets working remotely and going to school remotely, we want to invite them here to Williamsburg to do that. And we've basically got a living history book all around us, so why not bring your kids here if they're learning virtually? And so we're really excited to target this. We're going to work with media outlets like education trades and really hyper-focus on parents in areas where it is primarily virtual learning, and teachers, educators. On the sales front, I am happy to tell you that probably for the first time in Visit Williamsburg's history, we're posting sales leads. Despite the fact that most of the trade shows that we've been to are virtual in nature. But our sales director, who started in January, right before, she had 6 weeks in the office before we started to work remotely, is at her first trade show in French Lick, Indiana, which we sponsored. And it is for group meetings. So we're really excited, and she's already got some RFPs, and she's excited to get back and get those out to the industry. So this is a nice little chart of some of the things that we've been doing on the sales front, and continuing to focus on sales calls, albeit virtually. In production, I'm excited to tell you that Golf Magazine arrives in Williamsburg today. We've got a really cool content partnership with them, and so they'll be producing videos for us, articles, they'll be tweeting and pushing things out through Instagram while they're here this week. And the actual program will launch early next year in anticipation of spring 2021. We'll also be moving forward here in the next couple of weeks. We'll be hosting National Geographic. This is another content partnership that we're excited about. We will, as part of that, and this is Joshua Kogan is his name, and he's an Emmy award-winning photographer. He has been to 48 different countries. I mean, he's just got a resume that is pretty crazy. And so he'll be here in about a week and a half to cover Greater Williamsburg. And so we're excited to have him here. We're excited to tap into Nat Geo's followers and those who subscribe to their website articles and things like that. So with that, and I didn't kind of want to talk your ear off, but I wanted to leave some time for questions. I tend to go through a ton of content when I present to you, so, and it's hard with the mask on. It really is, so.
Take it off, take a breath.
Yeah, I know, it's like, whew, I need some Gatorade.
Yeah.
So with that, I am happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Vice Mayor Dent?
So thank you for the presentation. Obviously, there's a lot of information in the presentation, so I appreciate all the work you put into it. While it's not the information we would all like to see as far as the numbers go, it's at least encouraging that they're moving in the right direction. I also think that I really like the life at your pace and learn at your pace and creative ways to reach out to new audiences, and numbers reflect that you're reaching new audiences. So really appreciate all that work that's being done. I don't have any questions. It's just, again, I hope everybody takes an opportunity to review the numbers and look at the work that's being done, and where it could be easy to sit back idle and use COVID as a reason not to continue to come up with creative ideas. Obviously working to keep us moving forward, so I really appreciate that.
Thank you, I appreciate it, Mr. Vice Mayor.
Thanks, Vicki. A couple questions. We saw some of the ads, most of the ads had families, and some had masks, some didn't. Any reaction one way or another in terms of wanting to come to an area like this, showing a mask on everybody, even though they're related versus not?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a great question. In fact, we have a photo shoot in town as we speak, and we're shooting new assets with folks both in masks and without masks. And so we actually went to Busch Gardens on Saturday, and our talent had to be fully masked the entire time. I don't think that the days of wearing masks are going to go away anytime soon, and that was something that I was pretty emphatic about. If it does, hallelujah, we'll put those assets aside and hopefully never have to look at them again, but if it doesn't, we'll be prepared. Building out the summer campaign creative was extraordinarily challenging because who would have thought, we needed to have interpreters 6 feet away from guests, or we needed people in masks, and so we really did our best to kind of focus on those outdoor experiences and those wide open spaces.
Thanks. So looking at the visitors that come through our airports, so our 3 main airports with Richmond, Newport News, and Norfolk, what % of those visitors are actually coming through Newport News? Do you have any figures on that?
I don't have an exact percentage. I can tell you, just given consumer sentiment studies that we've seen, families are not traveling by air to vacation anywhere. They're packing up the car and they're driving. So where you used to have a smaller radius of sort of that drive market, it's 2-3 hours was doable. It's now 9-10 hours, which is why we kept Cleveland and Columbus in the mix for the summer campaign.
So the Virginia Beach just launched their new sports complex.
Yeah.
Are there any partnerships underway to sort of, latch on to that? People that might be coming there for a week, but maybe could spend a day in Williamsburg?
At this time, no, but you raise an excellent point.
And then back to air travel. So fortunately, I don't think we've heard any stories about cases of the virus being spread to air travel. Is which is a good thing. Are you hearing anything?
I have not. So I will tell you that kind of by the end of May, I had missed the smell of jet fuel so much that I was one of the first people to hop on a plane. I've been traveling. I was just in Boston about a week and a half ago, and to go into Massachusetts, you either need to quarantine for 14 days or you need to have passed a test, a COVID test in the last 72 hours. And I happily took the test and went on my merry way. And I think that seeing the increases in air passengers across the nation, I think that more and more it's going to become a normal part of travel. I saw an article the other day that JetBlue is looking to have kits available to those who book flights with them. So, yeah. And they're fogging the inside of planes. I think you're going to find a cleaner flying experience kind of post-COVID because of the foggers. There's JetBlue's partnering with Honeywell on a UV light program that they'll run through each aircraft in between flights. So I think you'll find it to be more sanitary experience moving forward. That doesn't stop me from wiping every single thing down, and I have travel Lysol.
My last question is there any campaign designed around Colonial Williamsburg's mini fireworks?
No.
And is that because it's going to be tough? And once they're open, a lot of those seats will be reserved fairly quickly?
So through our paid effort, we really focus on the overall brand and the overall destination, kind of pulling in components. But through our PR effort and our social media effort, we've been pushing out leads to the industry so that they supply us with event information. If we're hosting a travel writer or an influencer, those leads go out to the entire industry, and then we look at what comes back, because it's not incumbent on us to pick and choose who should get sort of the exposure. We want to make sure that we're spreading it out to everyone and being fair in how those experiences are selected. But every industry partner in Greater Williamsburg has the opportunity to take advantage of the PR and social stuff that we're doing. And we'll be launching a blog soon. And so at least 3 times a week, we'll have fresh new content. And so we're bringing in bloggers, third-party bloggers into the area to experience that. And so that's just another way to get very granular on specific destination programming.
Thank you.
Sure.
And I would like to thank you also for the presentation. It's nice to see a little bit of rebound in the numbers. And I think the proof is in the pudding. If you've been downtown in the past 2 to 3 weeks, there's, to me, been a visible uptick in the number of people there. And you can tell that quite a few of them are tourists. So I think that's really good. And I think, too, that we're seeing some things. I've been told people I've been taking golf lessons, and the golf courses have been doing a really good business this fall. A lot of people have moved their trips from the spring to the fall and are here in town now. And as far as air traffic, I think the new trend that I'm seeing is where people get on an airplane, fly around for an hour or so, and then come back, because they too have really missed the smell of jet fuel and seeing the ground from the air. Yeah. So looking forward to more new numbers and campaigns. So thanks.
Thank you as well, Vicki and Scott, for all the work that you all have been doing. I'm really encouraged by the idea that we're reaching more households for less of the cost while there is a building demand to travel somewhere. And it would be lovely to see that come to fruition in a wave of tourists. I clicked around in preparation for this with some of the influencers that you all had brought to the area, and that's such a neat way to market to a younger audience that really seemed to be working well. There was one, it was Amy Littleson, who was going through every place that she went, not only just the picturesque spots on Dog Street, but shouting out Bluetown Bistro for having great steaks and talking about getting an ice cream at Ely. So that was really neat to see someone who might be able to speak towards younger people with kids in a medium that isn't necessarily just on the television. I had two questions. The first is, I remember talking to Drew Gruber of the Williamsburg Battlefield Association a couple months ago, and he was speaking of how people are traveling more so nowadays in self-guided tours, at least through the battlefield arena. And so I was wondering if you all have any indication of if people are traveling differently here, whether the use of bed and breakfasts over hotels, and if they are guiding their own tour more so than they might have been before.
I don't have any sort of data points that I can share with you. I can share just sort of in staying on top of trends and, that, yeah, I mean, people are traveling differently. They're looking at sort of virtual tours. They're building out sort of their own itineraries. They're downloading menus in advance through QR codes on their cell phone. They're looking at things like travel or hotel brands that have self check-in. And so, I mean, it's wildly different today than a year ago.
Yeah.
And so I think you'll continue to find that. So thank you for acknowledging Scott. I'm joined here today by Scott Madden. He is a senior partner with our ad agency, Connolly Partners. And he's here because of our photo shoot that's taking course over the course of 4 days. And one of the things that we're shooting, which, I wish we had, 6 months ago, is 360 footage.
Okay.
So that we can start to build out 360 experiences that people can download on our website. So, so a great example is we did a carriage ride at Colonial Williamsburg. We had, we've got 8 people here, a family of 4, an active mature couple, and a millennial couple. And so we had the family in the swimming pool yesterday and took some 360 footage there. So we'll be able to, moving forward, continue to promote the area and just drive awareness through things like that too.
Fantastic. With all this good data about how people are traveling here, any information on how their stay was through exit polls? I wouldn't know exactly how you might source that data, but do you all do anything to check in on how people's stay was and if there are potential areas of improvement?
Outside of monitoring our social channels,
Okay.
we do not. Yeah, we do not. But I think that that's a great suggestion and perhaps something that we could look at doing in partnership with our hotel partners. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for all the work you all have been doing. It's got to be tough to shift to what no one was expecting.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Cimino, thank you. Like everybody says, I think great things are coming out of what you're doing over there, your staff, putting together great programs to keep the brand alive for people, even though many of them are traveling. And while we have seen some uptick, we've got a long way to go. And so I think it's good that we are working on content and the photographs and building those assets so that when we start to roll out of this, hopefully pretty soon, fingers crossed, who knows how long it's going to be, that we're prepared. Obviously, we have the budget. Budget's going to be a little tighter next year than it was this year because revenue's not there. But so I think you're doing a lot of good things there. Talk a little bit more about what you're seeing in terms of groups and conferences for the future. I know, I just watched a little segment on Vegas and no conferences going out there. So are we seeing any pressure for that?
Business travels, well, international, overseas travel will be the last to rebound. Sort of business travel to a certain degree is second to last. But that being said, it'll still happen. It'll just be smaller groups. It will look differently. So our sales director, Julia Smith-Young, she's out in Indiana as we speak, meeting with planners and like I said, she's already coming back to the area with RFPs. So it's starting to come back, but it's going to look different. Gotcha. Even U.S. Travel Association will be hosting their first conference here for Destination Marketing Organization Leadership late this year in November. So it'll be limited, it'll be smaller numbers, but it'll happen. Yeah.
And tour bus probably not going to see that.
You're starting to see buses come back a little bit. Now, I think a lot of tour companies, again, it's going to be slow, right? Because group tour companies have had to refit a lot of these buses. So I was on a bus for the first time since COVID a couple of weekends ago. And they had, partitions in between each seat, each row, and then in between each seat. I mean, it's the cleanest the bus has ever been. But they've had to kind of go through the same types of exercises as the airline industry without the funding that the airline industry received. So I think that's kind of still being figured out in real time. But again, people are trying to stay optimistic and plan for the future, but right now, that's still a tough area.
Gotcha. Well, good.
Yeah.
Well, again, thank you for coming out and thank you for joining Vicki today and hopefully get lots of, I mean, the weather's perfect.
Yeah,
Today.
it's great.
Nice to have some fall leaves out there. I don't guess we got a whole lot of that, but
Yeah.
keep up the good work and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Okay, thank you, Mayor.
Thank you.
you all.
Thank
Appreciate it.
you.
Thank you.
Okay, so that takes us now to item B, consideration and direction concerning the 2021 legislative agenda. Mr. Trivett.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. So every year, the city of Williamsburg does a legislative agenda. Almost all localities do some version of a legislative agenda that forwards their legislative priorities on to the General Assembly. It's primarily for their own local legislators to know what the priority topics are. I've said this to the city council before, I sort of think the idea of legislative agendas has sort of gotten antiquated. It's no longer nearly as relevant as it used to be, especially in today's age of immediate communication. I think text have replaced the legislative agenda in terms of this bill is up, how should I vote to favor the city of Williamsburg? So we still do it, though, because I think it provides value in the form of our meeting with the legislators in December, where we review sort of what our priorities are. But more importantly, we hear from them what they think the session will bring. So at this point in the year, this is really just to kick the process off. In October, the legislative agendas across the Commonwealth are just now starting to take shape. Most of our colleague localities have not had a conversation yet with their elected bodies about their legislative agenda. So I want you to think of this today as sort of priming the pump. We've got 30 days between now and when I will ask you to adopt a legislative agenda. So if you think of topics that you'd like us to consider or would like the council to consider including, we've got 30 days to get those added to the agenda. This is sort of just the first blush. So with that being said, how do we put this version together? Well, it's a little difficult because, as I said, it's so early in the process. Many of the concepts of what the General Assembly may or may not consider in the coming year are unknown. Of course, this year's a little different. We could sort of put the expected topics into a couple of different buckets. But what I do to put this version together is I look at what our community partners have already, and I look at what the support organizations also have. The support organizations are really the most helpful because they've already started their process because the limited number of board meetings they have during the year. By October, they have usually at least had a conversation as a body on legislative targets in the coming session. So particularly the Virginia Municipal League, their meeting is in October, and they won't officially vote on the legislative agenda for the VML until that meeting, but they've already posted a draft. They've shared it widely with the participating localities. So it's easy to look through there and try to identify the themes that may be most closely related to the city of Williamsburg's interests. And I do the same thing with Virginia First Cities and many of the other organizations, particularly the HRPDC. On the community partner side, as I said, it's so early, they've really not had a lot of thought into what the legislative agenda will be. So for most of them, I send them all emails or talk to them personally and say, what can you tell me about what you think the targets are going to be? They may not have a lot of details. They certainly don't have any necessary wording together yet, but they at least know maybe we're going to talk about broadband or we're going to talk about taxes or what the case may be. So I take that information and I sort of put together this first draft. So what I do is I try to group these into components. So we have the intent statement, of course, which really doesn't change much. And then I have the priority issues, the other issues of focus, and the partner agencies issues. This is how we've organized the legislative agenda for the last few years. We've received some comments from the legislators that it's easy to see what the key pieces of our agenda are. So under priority issues, there's obviously every year a whole host of things that don't get acted on or don't get fully acted on in the General Assembly. This first item is one that has been on our agenda for many years, communication sales and use tax. And what we're saying here is that since 2008, or really 2006, 2007 timeframe, when the communication sales and use tax was enacted by the General Assembly, it's not been updated. It's in two ways. Number one is it's not been updated to reflect the current tax rate, sales tax rate across the state. It's not been updated to reflect the regional tax rate, sales tax rates across the state. And then in addition to that, it's not been modernized to reflect a tax on current communication trends. If you're like me, you don't have a landline at home anymore. You may not even have cable. You stream everything using your internet connection and you use a cell phone. And so we would really like to see the communication sales and use tax modernized to reflect the statewide sales tax, the regional sales tax to the extent that it can, and be modernized so that it can apply to those new forms of technology. I asked Ms. Dameron to do a little bit of research on what this would mean to us. We did not do this in the last few years because I thought it'd be interesting to pull the numbers. In 2008, the city of Williamsburg received just over $800,000 in communication sales and use tax. And in 2021, we're expecting that number to be just slightly more than $500,000. So around a 28% reduction over that time period. It would sure be nice to have a few extra $100,000 in the budget, especially as we're dealing with COVID-19. The next item is I-64 widening. Now, this is a topic that's been on the agenda for a year, but it's been on the agenda in the larger context for many years. As you know, we've been working our way through a widening project of I-64 from Richmond all the way to the end, and have been fairly successful. We've got 3 segments that are still underway. One of those segments is a focus, though, for the policy agendas, the legislative agendas for many of our partner agencies, because it's this gap roughly between Williamsburg and New Kent County that is outside of a funding bracketed area of a transportation planning organization, which has made it sort of this piece of the project with no advocate for funding outside of New Kent County, who would, of course, benefit most directly. So for the last 2 years, we've been asking the state government to consider ways in which they could fund this gap. There's been a little bit of progress. There were some funding initiatives in other parts of the state that produced a surplus of funding that could be directed to I-64 projects. And so last year there was a push to try and apply some of that money to the gap. I can't tell you the status of that request. I don't know that it's been fully acted upon yet, but I think anything that we can do to continue to raise the legislators' awareness of this issue is important. I know that they consider it a priority as well. Next is the ever-present maintain or increase funding of essential services. As we know, this is a constant battle, the unfunded mandates, the reduced funding for services that we're required to provide. This is an item that's on pretty much every legislative agenda across the Commonwealth as we advocate for locality autonomy and at the same time adequate funding to provide the services we are expected and required to provide. The new item for this year that I have drafted and placed on the proposal in front of you is regarding broadband connectivity. Essentially, if you look at what the state does to address broadband connectivity, they have several different programs, but pretty much all of the programs, like the Virginia Access Initiative, are designed to only address what I call last mile connectivity issues. So areas where there is lacking infrastructure to provide service. If you look at the definitions provided in the state code for adequate service or service at all, it's not just what we think of immediately. There's no line in the ground. There's no place for me to connect if I wanted to. It's also about speed. So you have to keep in mind that some of these rural areas that we talk about, even though maybe the county has access, it's not at a speed that makes the service relevant. What I've said here in our agenda item is that we need to now take the next step of that conversation beyond just rural connectivity and lack of infrastructure. We need to talk about affordability. And as I see it, affordability can be broken into two components. The first is a lack of income to afford the service generally. And the second one is a lack of competitiveness in the market to help keep the cost low. I think that we really need to start focusing on both of those in addition to the infrastructure question, right? So what I have said in our agenda item, when you read it, is that we need to advocate with the General Assembly that they look to create or broaden, they either need to create new programs or broaden existing programs that would allow us to address that. I have suggested in the text that they consider two new grant programs, one that deals with the affordability issue and one that would incent ingenuity or innovation in the service provision. What I think that would do is challenge localities across the state to rethink how to provide broadband internet connectivity that's not just putting fiber in the ground, which is extremely expensive. I think there are better solutions on the horizon. Some of them are just being considered, but I don't think it's too early for us as a state and as a community to consider testing some of those, especially given the cost savings that could result. I did go one step further than I normally would do in the legislative agenda, and I suggested a funding source for this initiative. We just talked about the communication sales and use tax, and so what I said is I linked these two items together, that if they were going to consider creating these new grant programs, one thing they could consider doing would be to fix the communication sales and use tax issue earlier in our agenda and have that be the funding source for these new programs. Certainly that seems to make sense to me, a tax on communication services that then benefits the users of communication services. How that gets implemented, I don't know. There'd be a lot of details to work out, whether that's a state program that you then apply to as a locality that gets awarded, or whether they return the collections to the locality for the purposes of building out this network. I think it's all worthy of conversation. So it'll be interesting to see how that gets received. One of the reasons I put broadband on our agenda is that as I did that calling around and emailing around to the various partner agencies that we work with, pretty much everybody in the region is going to have a broadband item on their agenda. As I said, it's still too early to know what the text of those items will be. It's likely not going to read like ours. I think for the most part, they will be advocating for funding for last mile connections, but also improved fiber rings in the south side, maybe even on the peninsula, so that we have stronger and faster data available at the core, not just at the edges. So it'll be interesting to see how the broadband items take shape going into the General Assembly. So the next category of issues are other issues of focus, and we divide these into three separate subheadings: good governance, transportation priorities, state and local partnerships. Under good governance, for a long time, we had redistricting as an issue, and we saw some progress on that, so it's no longer on the agenda. Now we're focused on economic development funding and funding for Go Virginia. Transportation priorities is another change. We used to have the I-64 projects in two places, under the top priorities on the first page, and then under the transportation priorities as well. So one was focused on the gap, and one was focused on the larger project. Now that the larger project is wholly funded, for the most part, we're now just focused on the gap, so I removed that. I did include under the rail item some strengthened language based on where we are with the projects that we're sort of holding up high-speed rail as a priority on the peninsula. I sort of think that if you look at what all the studies recommended in terms of funding priorities, we're nearing the end of the hurdles that the state said, wait on this to get done, wait on that to get done. And so I think now is the time for us to sort of renew the conversation about taking the step required to bring higher speed rail to the peninsula. And then, of course, state and local partnerships. One of the things that we do is we ask folks like the Tourism Council, the Business Council, William and Mary, Colonial Williamsburg, if they have legislative agenda items that they'd like the City Council to advocate for. Typically, William and Mary has a few, Thomas Nelson generally. And so as we move into the next month, We will get more of those. I've already updated William and Mary's as well as Thomas Nelson's. But as I said, it's still early yet. So as we get to the November meeting where I present the agenda for your consideration, it will have the official language from all of those partner agencies that submit. So this is still very much a work in progress. I sort of jumped ahead to this slide. So partner agency support, one of the things that we do via our legislative agenda, I think when I first came to the city and updated the legislative agenda, I said, the days of a 30-page legislative agenda are over. There's just nobody that has the time to flip through 30 pages of well-thought-out analysis by the locality on a particular issue. And so we condensed it down to 2 pages. One of the ways that we were able to do that is by simply adopting by reference the partner agency agendas as well. So by being a member, by voting in favor of those agendas when they get adopted at VML, the VFC, the HRPDC, and the HRTPO, we are advocating on their behalf through our legislators for their items as well. So where do we go from here? September, we start putting the draft together. October, we present that draft. Council will consider it during this month. If there's items that come to mind as you serve on boards and commissions over the next month, if somebody says something to you, hey, this would be good to advocate for, just let me know, and we'll do our best to reflect it in the agenda for consideration by the council. And then when we get to November, we'll be asking you to adopt the final version of the agenda. In December, we usually have the legislative event. This is an opportunity for us to sit down with the legislators and just have an informal conversation about what they see for the session upcoming and also how our objectives play into that. And then in January, the session begins. So this year, according to the pre-filing agenda, the session will convene on January the 13th. It is a short session, which is, you know, it's supposed to be 30 days, but it's always been extended to 45 days. So I expect that will happen again. And it should, if it goes to 45 days, conclude on about February the 27th. So a lot will get done in that short session. With some of you, I talked about what I think the priorities might be for the Assembly. I think that we can certainly consider equity to be a priority. I think anything dealing with the budget will be a priority. And of course, the larger bucket of COVID-19 issues will still be a lingering issue for the Assembly. And I think the localities too. And that's the draft. So as I said, you've got a month now to sort of consider this and let me know if anything comes to mind that you think should be a priority. I told some of you in the briefings earlier, just, you know, the City Council has a long-standing tradition of staying out of the national politic arena. And so one way to think of that is when items are brought to us for consideration to be included in our agenda, if the City of Williamsburg's support or lack thereof really is not going to move the needle on that issue, then all that really does is drag the attention away from the items on our agenda that we do have impact on. And so I think it's best if we try to stay away from those. That's not to say that every national issue is not something of importance to Williamsburg. You may remember the drilling question that came up off the coast of Virginia Beach. We took a position because it was important to us that vista off of Virginia Beach not be ruined in any way. So I think that's an example of where occasionally a federal policy does have direct impact and we would want to weigh in. But for the most part, I think we try to stay out of the national stage. With that, Mayor, I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Trivett. You know, I do agree with the being more brief in our legislative agenda statement. To your point, I think anymore, you know, our communications are very effective through a text message to our legislators, and it seems like we spend more issues in recent years on issues that have popped up.
That's right.
And you know, I think if we try to do too much on paper, you know, it kind of takes away our ability to be effective in some of the shorter conversations that we need to have. So this all looks good to me. Vice Mayor Dent?
Mr. Trivett, I just had one question on the communication and sales and use tax. Since that has been on the table for so many years, and I know you're well engaged in legislative issues, have you seen any progress at all with do you have a feeling that at some point it's going to be, and I know that's speculation, but you have any feeling that there's going to be a change?
You know, I think the industry is very effective at arguing against modernization of the tax. I think every year, I mean, I would say, if you're curious, just take a look at like the Norfolk legislative agenda, the Virginia Beach legislative agenda. Almost always they have a communication, sales, and use tax item on their agenda. And of course, their size is so much bigger that the numbers really are staggering in terms of what they are not receiving over the same period of years. If there was ever a time for considering adjusting that tax, it's probably now, as localities all across the Commonwealth are hurting from the loss of revenues. If there was ever a time to adjust that tax, it's now, because I think its application to address the inequities of broadband service in communities. Williamsburg is fortunate. We have very few areas in the city that don't have access due to infrastructure. We have plenty of spaces where we could do better in terms of competitiveness and income affordability. So I think the application of that tax now is very poignant. So I'm hopeful that by having this item sort of uniquely placed on our agenda in the context of broadband this year, we'll open a conversation that's not been had before, which is rather than just giving localities additional funding to offset mandated services, here is a real need that's been identified all across the Commonwealth and a potential way to address it. Every community in the Commonwealth could benefit from the modernizing of the tax, and I believe every community in the Commonwealth could deploy it to good use to address broadband connectivity.
Okay. Well, one other thing came to mind. When the session begins, other than updates on the website, I know you've been engaged in that in the past, or are you still doing that, or do we have someone that we're going to be utilizing to keep us posted?
That's a good question, Vice Mayor. Yeah, I mean, in years past, when I was not the city manager, I was the assistant city manager, I followed the legislative calendar closely. I spent a lot of days in Richmond, attending committee meetings, speaking on the city's behalf, following legislation closely. And I sent, I think it was a weekly update to council on here's what's happening legislatively. And we just don't have the staff or the time to do that right now. In a couple of different budgets passed, I have presented the idea of bringing someone on board, either a contractor or another employee that would take that on, because I do feel like, I mean, everywhere I've ever worked, I have said, if you're not there, you're not there. I mean, it's really that simple. And so I think having a presence is really important. It'd be great if we could afford to do that. It'll probably be a target of mine as we go into the budget season again. The cheaper way to do that is to hire an advocate to work on our behalf. We've had previous conversations with James City County about us jointly doing that. James City County in years past was interested. Obviously, that's one of the first things that gets cut, though, in a hard budget. I think we'll renew those conversations again this year. One of the reasons that we considered doing it jointly is because an area of advocacy where we could benefit most greatly would be on school funding. Our joint system. And so we're about to have a joint meeting with the school board. We're going to hear more about what the funding needs are and the lack of resources available to address them, and also the historic lack of support from the state for those needs. So maybe that could be a driver this year that sees that funding get approved, and we could hire a joint legislative advocate.
Thank you.
Basil?
Yeah, thanks, Drew. And I will also be brief with one question. Could you go back to slide 8? The one that says community partners. There we go. So thinking about the broadband initiative, would it strengthen our case and our advocacy if we were to include both the library system and the school system as partners in that initiative? So not only would they help us in terms of talking to Richmond, but they would have their own advocacy through their their disciplines, maybe.
Absolutely, that's a good idea.
Thank you.
Mr. Ramsey?
Thank you for the presentation, and the only thing I wondered about, and it was something we talked about this morning, was perhaps adding air traffic and the airport to the transportation priorities in some way, as far as, you know, overall to the state and not just specifically to our region here.
Sure. So I think that's an excellent suggestion. When it was put together the draft, it just did not occur to me. So it's a little bit challenging because there's not a direct ask that's readily apparent to me in terms of what we would be asking for, and I really hate to just include sort of generic statements of support because the legislators will ask, what would you like us to do about that? And we need to have some plan. So I think what I will do, if it's the will of the council, is I will put together sort of a rough sentence on support and send that to the airport director and ask for his input, and hope that he can come up with some tangible action item that the General Assembly could consider. You know, a lot of the issues that they're facing, at least through the email traffic that I see from the director, are on the federal level, not so much on the state level. But certainly we could put something in front of the General Assembly that they could consider. I think it's absolutely worth putting in even a generic comment of support for air service in tourism communities. And so maybe it is a generic statement of, in communities across the Commonwealth, air service is critical to economic development, whether it's tourism or not, and the state should be doing all that it can to see that air service continues. So we'll work some language out. I'll send it to Mike at the airport, and we'll see what we come back with in November.
I have full confidence you'll come up with something really good, so thanks.
Now you've set the bar too high.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that report, Drew. I only have one question, similar one as I had this morning. Just thought the public may be interested to hear about the potential widening of one of their thoroughfares, the I-64 corridor, having seen it close to Richmond and now close to Newport News. What would you say is the likelihood of the General Assembly pushing that forward and potentially putting 3 lanes where there are now 2 close to where we are in Williamsburg?
You know, I think in years past, the likelihood has been really good. I don't know what the mayor or Councilman Maslin or Councilman Ramsey thought about last year's meeting with the legislators. This came up, and they seemed genuinely supportive. I think it's going to require some heavy lifting, though, in terms of identifying the funding and then fighting for that funding to come for this project. Because there are so many good, worthy projects, not just on the I-64 corridor still, but all over the Commonwealth for transportation funding, that it really requires a champion to advocate for it. Unfortunately, it's sort of a rural area that this portion of the I-64 corridor, and so that champion hasn't really emerged yet. But I think that the HRTPO, the HRPDC will include this on their agendas. We've enjoyed the support of even the Southside communities who only sort of tangentially benefit from this. So I think it will be a priority. I think the trick is going to be identifying funding and then hanging on to the funding through the allocation and approval process.
Okay, thank you.
Could I just ask a follow-up question to that? I was under the impression that the funding was supposed to come from the I-81 tolling and that it would go towards I-64, but I guess the caveat there is that it was for congestion areas in I-64.
Yeah, so last year there was a lot of discussion about projects along, I hesitate to say, but I-81 that had funding availability, and some of that funding was supposed to go to I-64 projects. I don't pretend to understand the nuance of how that happens, but that's what it was designed for. Then the question was, well, which I-64 projects should that be applied to? And I think that question has not been fully resolved.
Okay.
So yes, I think so. I think that we're probably a step closer than we were last year, but we still have to be sort of the consummate advocate that this is a priority, even though it's not in our jurisdiction, because it doesn't have an advocate if it's not for the neighboring jurisdictions.
Part of that lack of advocacy is it doesn't fall into the Richmond Area
Right.
Metropolitan Transportation Act, and it doesn't follow in the Hampton Road, so it's in no man, it doesn't follow
Yeah.
in anybody's. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, you use the word tangentially supports the south side. I mean, I think it does impact a lot of those folks, and so I think part of that advocacy is going to have to come from all of us on the peninsula, all the way to Virginia Beach, because, you know, of the hourglass, it's
Right.
checked up, so I think benefits us all to have that done.
Yeah, you know, it might be a good topic to bring up at the Peninsula Mayors and Chairs meeting,
Okay,
to see if they would be interested in being a champion.
I'll bring that up.
Do I have a follow-up on the follow-up?
Sure.
So,
But you said brief.
this will be brief. So I remember all the excitement within the Commonwealth of Virginia, June 1, several years ago, when they, I don't remember how many millions of dollars to come up with the Know Your Zone philosophy for the hurricane. And they said, here's the zones, and when your zone's called, you get on the I-64 and you go west. And I don't think they told people where to stop. You know, it's like, do they go to California or what? Could we use that, you know, the concern for hurricanes to say, hey, that's why we need it to be continued, because it'll become a bottleneck with the Know Your Zone philosophy.
I think that's a good point of advocacy. When we've broached that before, you know, Williamsburg is the high spot. So I think when you say nobody told them where to go, it sort of implied they would get off the interstate in Williamsburg. And even during emergencies where we had to activate statewide shelters, that seemed to be the implied messaging. So it's just on the edge. But I do think that ultimately widening 64 all the way will benefit the whole region economically. I think even those people that advocate for the mega region concept, no matter what capacity they're advocating it for, having that throughput just makes a lot of sense. For us, I think it brings both good and bad. You know, I've said before to the city council that expanding that to make the flow easier and faster will make the housing pressure on our market and James City County, York County even greater. But on the whole, I think we'd rather be dealing with balancing those economic pressures with the need for additional revenue in the budget.
I think it's also a matter of national security.
Right.
Anything else? Good. All right, so that takes us on to City Council, thank you, Mr. Trivett, to City Council communications. Anybody?
No, nothing now.
Yep. Saturday, there was our proclamation for Heal Williamsburg, Heal the Nation Day, given to Williamsburg Action and coming to the table for an event that they held on local racial equity and conversations around it. So thank you very much to Doug for signing that proclamation. I enjoyed reading it on the council's behalf and having some remarks. I think it was well received.
Thank you for attending. You did a fantastic job. Tourism Council, we have hired a new legal counsel who's really just affirmed everything that this Tourism Council is doing in terms of bookkeeping, auditing, transparency, who do we report to, and those types of things. So that work is still going on. They did advise that the Tourism Council should have its own EIN number, employer identification number, and then do its own payroll. So I think that's underway here shortly. So that's moving in a good positive direction.
And that was reported out to the Business Council's last board meeting as well.
Good. Scheduled meetings, Mr. Trivett?
Yeah, so we have the Board of Zoning Appeals tomorrow. Economic Development Authority meet October the 7th. Our City Council meeting is on October the 8th. The ARB is scheduled to meet on the 12th and again on the 13th. On the 12th, they'll be doing another review of design guidelines. On the 14th, we have the Planning Commission work session, and on the 27th, the ARB will meet again.
Questions? That takes us to the next open forum. Anybody in the audience like to come forward? Seeing none, we'll close the open forum, and Vice Mayor Dent, I believe you have something for us.
We do. I move to go into closed session pursuant to Section 2.2-3711 of the Code of Virginia for the purpose of discussing one personnel matter per subparagraph 1 concerning appointments to boards and commissions.
Second?
Rico?
Mr. Rogers?
Aye.
Ms. Ramsey?
Aye.
Mayor Pons?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Dent?
Aye.
Mr. Maslin?
Aye.
We're going to take a brief break and then go into closed session. We'll come back out and wrap up the meeting.